The Igbo rising, not forgotten, not erased, still chosen, still called. Every battle was a fingerprint of prophecy. Every wound was a witness. Because from Biafra to beyond, the suffering was not just a tragedy. It was a testimony that the Igbo people were and still are marked by the hand of God. The narrative of colonization has long been told from the perspective of European explorers who discovered Africa and its people, painting indigenous civilizations as backward, chaotic, and in need of salvation. But this narrative was never about discovery. It was about domination. The Igbo people, like many great African civilizations, were not waiting to be found. They were thriving, self-governing, deeply spiritual, and advancing with their own systems of law, ethics, education, and trade. The colonizers did not stumble upon a forgotten people. They strategically targeted a powerful and spiritually rooted nation that posed a threat to their imperial agenda. The Igbo were not just another tribe. They were a living echo of ancient wisdom, a civilization guided by divine codes and the guardians of a spiritual identity that couldn't be enslaved without resistance. The British colonizers didn't fear chaos. They feared organization. They feared the deep-rooted belief the Igbo had in one supreme God, Chukwu, Okike, Abiyama, long before the Bible was ever handed to them in colonial schools. They feared the Igbo's ancient traditions that closely resembled the Hebraic customs found in the Torah. Rituals of purification, strict moral laws, family inheritance systems, covenantal oaths, circumcision on the 8th day, Sabbath reverence, and an unshakable cultural insistence on justice and balance. These weren't primitive beliefs. They were spiritual reflections of a people who had preserved something far older than colonizers could understand or accept. To suppress that kind of power, they didn't need to understand it. They needed to dismantle it. And so the British launched a systematic campaign not to uplift, but to break. The Igbo's decentralized political systems, village-based democracies governed by councils of elders and priests, were seen as a threat to colonial control. The British called it acephalous, meaning headless, but it was in fact a sophisticated form of communal governance, where power was not abused, but distributed. This horizontal structure meant there were no kings or central figures that colonizers could bribe, convert, or coerce. So they invented chieftaincy titles, imported indirect rule, and began reshaping Igbo governance from the outside in. They mocked the Igbo religion, calling it paganism, yet many of its spiritual principles aligned with biblical concepts. They replaced ancestral shrines with churches, but they could not erase the ancestral memory. They introduced Christianity not as a faith of love, but as a weapon of control, using it to re-educate, reprogram, and redefine the Igbo worldview. Schools became places not of enlightenment but of erasure. The language was replaced with English. The stories were replaced with foreign fables. The gods were replaced with imported doctrines. But in spite of all this, the spirit of the Igbo refused to be extinguished. What frightened the British most was not the Igbo's resistance with weapons. It was their spiritual resilience, their unyielding belief in their identity, and their collective memory of who they were. Colonization sought to erase that identity, not because it was weak, but because it was too strong to be controlled. A people who know who they are cannot be enslaved. A people with divine purpose cannot be manipulated forever. The colonizers knew that. That's why they worked tirelessly to suppress not just the body of the Igbo people, but their mind, their spirit, their sense of divine self. The Igbo were also targeted for economic reasons. They had long been skilled traders, blacksmiths, farmers, and artisans. Their wealth was generated not by exploitation, but by productivity and ingenuity. Towns like Onitsha, Nari, and Arochukwu were centers of trade and spiritual learning, long before the British flag was planted. The Aro Confederacy in particular, with its spiritual influence and wide commercial network, became a focal point for British suppression. It wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion of a people already rich in knowledge, connected to vast networks, and unafraid to wield spiritual and intellectual power. And perhaps most profound is this: beneath the political and economic targeting of the Igbo was a deeper unspoken fear, a spiritual fear. The colonizers may not have admitted it, but their actions revealed it. The Igbo carried something ancient, something divine, something that could not be explained by colonial logic or dismissed by academic prejudice. Their cultural alignment with lost Hebrew traditions, their consistent invocation of one creator God, their patterns of exile and resilience, all pointed to something the West was not ready to acknowledge. The Igbo were not just Africans, they were a mirror of prophecy. When you are chosen, you will be targeted. When you carry truth, the world will try to silence you. This is not new. The Israelites were enslaved, scattered, and attacked for centuries, not because they were weak, but because they were carriers of divine covenant. And the same can be said of the Igbo. They were not colonized because they lacked civilization, but because they embodied a civilization too powerful to be left alone. They carried within them echoes of ancient Israel, and such a people could never be allowed to rise without resistance. So the British rewrote the story. They called them backward. They claimed to bring civilization, but what they brought was erasure, and what they found was a people more civilized than their textbooks could comprehend. The Igbo were already standing before they were invaded. They were already organized before they were labeled. They were already blessed before they were baptized. And though they were suppressed, they were never defeated. Today, as the world uncovers long-buried truths, the spirit of the Igbo is rising again. The world is beginning to see that colonization was not discovery. It was fear wrapped in violence, domination disguised as salvation. But the truth is louder than the lie. The Igbo were not lost. They were hidden. Not erased, they were buried under centuries of falsehood. And now, like gold purified by fire, they are emerging stronger, wiser, and more certain of who they are. The colonizers tried to target and dismantle a divine people. But what is chosen by God cannot be undone by men. The Igbo people were never a footnote in someone else's history. They are a headline in the story of divine resilience. And no empire, no textbook, no weapon can destroy a people whose roots are deep in God. You don't stumble upon a people like that. You fear them, you target them, but you never ever erase them. There are mysteries that history tries to bury, but can never fully silence. One of the most profound is the unshakable connection between the Igbo language and the ancient Hebrew tongue. A connection that transcends coincidence, that breaks the boundaries of colonial geography, and that forces us to confront a deeper truth. Language is more than communication. It is identity, memory, and bloodline. And when a people's language carries echoes of another ancient tongue, especially one as sacred as Hebrew, we must ask ourselves not only how, but why. The Igbo language is rich in structure, symbolism, and spirituality. It is not a mere collection of sounds. It is a living code, a vessel of ancestral memory, divine consciousness, and cultural resilience. For centuries, scholars and spiritual thinkers alike have noticed a strange but powerful similarity between Igbo and Hebrew, between the way they form names, construct prayers, reference God, and establish moral commands. And these similarities aren't shallow or forced. They run deep, cutting across phonetics, grammar, and spiritual concepts that align far too closely to be dismissed as coincidence. Take, for example, the sacred name of God. In Hebrew, he is called Yahweh,